So the two presentations, the first one was mainly focused on the wooden structure, but second one, actually the Dr. Miyagi, since he's also the representative person of the Byodoin, he also mentioned about the importance of opening the temple as a tourist heritage. And that was very interesting because not only the scientific part, but all the design for preservation of the World Heritage was depending upon the policy, how to restructure not only the structure itself, but also the organizational framework was very important. So I would like to highlight several things, but since the time is limited, the first point of the discussion, I would like to request for the more severe issue of the preservation might be the Japanese climate condition, because Japanese climate is typical for very high humidity and very intensive storm and wind and sometimes snow, and it lasts very long time. The temperature difference for the summer and winter is over 40 to 50 degrees Celsius. Under that condition, and why the wooden structure is appropriate and lasts very long time, that might be a very big mystery from my side, because the wood looks like it doesn't last long time, but it is last very, very long time. So, and also Japan, we have very big earthquake too. So if you could highlight why and how do you think to preserve the wooden structure? So from one by side.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Yamashiki. Well, wood is quite interesting materials. Actually, the one from the bioresources, so that wood is quite sensitive to the moisture. Is actually, therefore, when we utilize those timber from the wood, we dry them first, so that we actually taking out the moisture from the wood, from 80% to the 20 or less than 20% in moisture content. And to keep that, then wood is quite, how can I say, durable. But once in a condition under the water, I mean the moisture, then it easily decayed. So can be degraded within several years. But like Byodoin temple and other Japanese temple, the roof is rather large to avoid the moisture, the rains and so on, to the main structure members of the wood, such as columns and pier and beams and so on. Therefore, maybe during those Japanese archaeological history, how we can avoid the moisture from the wooden structure. That is maybe the secret. Wood can be last for such a long time.
Because if you take a look at the Japanese historical structure, they have a tile or ceramic roof and wooden structure. So that combination might be very, very important.
That's right. That actually comes from the Chinese structural technology.
Okay. So from this point,
excuse me.
Please, Miyagi.
Yeah. Anyway, now in addition to the remarks, the statement by Professor Kawai, I think the structural composition of the most of the traditional, wooden house or buildings is composed of lots of parts, and each part will not singly, destroy or kind of in the bad condition, which means some part will be really fragile for the weather, but some other part will be very strong. So that once you found a very, very bad conditions wooden structure or wooden parts in somewhere in the entire structures, you can replace it with a new part. For example, in the case of Byodoin temple, probably the main column, beams, and other structurally very strong strength is needed will be the original. But other areas, probably some of those very close to the roof, would be replaced many times in the past, I'm sure. At this time, we also replaced some of the parts which was actually replaced in 50 years ago. So the some part will be very, very getting the bad condition within in a very, very short period of time, like 50 or 100 years. But some other part will be last so long. So that kind of differences. So to identify those kind of differences and replace it properly in periodical repairment or restoration, that kind of procedure make possible to stand for a long time.
Yeah, you want to talk
Yeah,
about that?
it is very thankful. Such a replacement, we got the samples of the such aged wood.
Yeah. Also, the craftsman and carpenter technology is also quite important to preserve those kind of technical resources. That is another thing. So that's why we have to continue to do a restoration work as much as possible to give a job for them. That's
to preserve the human resources adequate and appropriate for that. Yeah, that will be a very important issue. I was wanting to highlight that topic in the next, but he already introduced. But the preservation and the periodic reconstruction need the human resources and also the cultural or technological conservation, because it lasts 1,000 years already, right? Since the construct, or 1,200 years since the capital of Kyoto was first built. But another issue might be the timber. How can you secure the same type of timber or different type of the timber? Because historically, the most timber coming from domestically. However, the recent year there are the surge or the down of the production of the Japanese domestic timber. So we might think about using the international prepared timber, and what the characteristics of the wooden material might be changing in the time. So can you address this issue too?
Actually, Professor Yamamoto of the University of Tokyo, who was the head of the University Forest of Tokyo University, he started to put a new role of the university forest to produce, because we need a huge timber. The diameter is so large, so that we need like a timber or trees or cedar trees of the over 200 and 300 years old to preserve those kind of materials for the reconstruction. But in many commercial forests will not do that because it's not so good for the benefit of the, and it takes so much time and to get the refund from the those guys. So that probably some public or national forests should do that, but I don't know if they are interested in that. But that's quite important things, I'm sure.
Yeah, this is quite important things because it is non-commercially oriented. However, you should have a big timber.
Also, we need certain development works for the new composite materials.
Oh, that's right.
For example, like I showed before in Edo period, a Great Buddha Pavilion was actually constructed by the laminated beams and columns.
In Edo period.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So now we have different type of
materials, and new composite wood materials as well.
So in the future, do you think those wooden historical heritage can be replaced by the new material? What do you think about that?
Sometimes it's necessary, but it can be also replaced when we get proper amount of the large scale wooden beams and round wood logs.
Okay.
But I understand, and I think it is necessary to complete material to be developed for the protection and the restoration of the cultural heritage. But on the other hand, UNESCO will be, I don't know, probably very much concerned about authenticity of the structure of a material to be used, or technology or technique or skills to be applied to do a reconstruction of things. So it will be quite controversial things, and I don't know the answer, but at this moment.
If you highlight the UNESCO, I also would like to ask you, because there are eastern region, we preserved Udon structure culture. Historically, we have Udon cities was built in the east part of the India, but other part of the world is built stone culture, like including Europe. And there are some two different trends of how to preserve the wooden structure as a historical heritage, or stone structure as a cultural heritage. And climate might be the key factor, but not only the climate, the material necessary to preserve will be very important. I don't know, Dr. Miyagi can talk about something, or Dr. Crowley can highlight this issue, I don't know. But we would like to highlight this issue.
Let's see. I think when you use a new material, I think you need a different skill. And my question is how to, and sometimes that skill will be more machine-oriented things. Not machine or mechanical procedure of the treatment of the material. And in that case, what's going to happen for the manual skills of the craftsman or carpenter? So I think when we talk a new material for the restoration, I think it should be go with the skills or techniques or technology to do it altogether. That's quite critical to me.
Thank you. Since the time is limited, the last minute, I would like to focusing more to user science and also the changing the structure as a tourist-based structures for the purpose of, I think the presentation of Dr. Miyagi was very, very fascinating because he mentioned about the restructuring the Byodoin temples apart from the religion group, is becoming independent and based on the tourism. And that concept might be the key to secure the periodic reconstruction. And if you could highlight, we are discussing the science, but science should be based on the financial strong support.
Compared with other countries, like some European country mostly, the Japanese society are not so willing to putting public money for or subsidies for the protections and the restoration of the cultural heritage. For example, when we do restoration work for the temple, subsidy is only 50%. Rest of the amount we have to pay for ourselves. To do that, I think we need a solid foundation or solid funds to reserve. But we may have every 50 years we have a measure, restoration works, and in the meantime we may have some natural disaster or caused a problem or restoration work. But we are lucky because we have so many visitors to but other small temple or small shrine or individual who owns such a precious cultural heritage, I think we need to do some of the. And the other day I was called by Japanese cabinet, and they asked me some question about the how to what is a new way or new procedure to do to raise those kind of monies. And my answer was to have a different type of the organization or different type of corporate. We are a religious corporation, Shukyo Hoji in Japanese. But probably when we're getting subsidies or we're getting a donation, we don't have much, donation from the public body or corporate. And the corporate has a certain their own, I would say, some regulation or something like that to make a donation to one specific religious body. If it's a public body, that would be okay. So that probably we call cultural heritage protection corporate or something like that. New type of corporation, public corporation, should be established to get more donation from public sectors. That would be quite difficult, important things to think about. But for many Japanese Buddhism temple, they have already have kind of the advantages. That Shukyo Hojin has they don't have to pay tax as long as you are performing the religious activities. So that drawing a line between protection or public-oriented protection and religious activity is quite difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine because the very few percentage of the subsidy in the restoration one, it was amazing, I think, because considering the amount of the scale of the building, it's huge. Since we are having very few time, but I would like to invite one question from the audience about two speaker, please. Dr. Crowley. So if you, please. Can you provide the microphone from?
Thank you very much. On the other hand, I did have other opportunities to speak, so I don't want to monopolize. Is it okay? I listened to you with great interest, and it made me think of two things. And then in the meantime, we had a brief side discussion, which made me think of a third. The third is a very practical question. Funding for cultural heritage issues is usually driven by indirect tax subsidies. In other words, the deduction of donations or special tax regimes for various kinds of expenditure. The way you put it gave the impression that those subsidies were not generous in Japan. But I'd just like to check that, just to understand factually what the situation is. The more fundamental question that struck me is, you referred to UNESCO and to the question of authenticity. When we preserve, we don't really preserve buildings or pieces of wood. We preserve meanings. And the question of what things mean is central to what should be preserved and how it should be preserved, because it tells us why. And what's very interesting about the examples you gave is that they are examples of continuous use and continuous change, which is not the case of all heritage. There are cases in many parts of the world of heritage that is in one sense dead, no longer used, and which is to be preserved as a ruin, as a memory. Whereas these are buildings that are to be preserved as living places of possibly worship, but certainly tourism. So I'd just like your comments on that. How does this question of meaning arise? And that connects to the other question, which is very related, which is that one of the bridges between science and culture is politics, as we were discussing this morning. In this case, the political framework that gives certain things meaning and creates or doesn't create the financial conditions where those meanings can be maintained. So I'd be interested in any comments you might have about the politics of heritage as you see it. In other words, the principles about what should be preserved and why, and perhaps also what shouldn't be preserved, because there's always that tension. What are the things in Japan, for instance, that people do not want to preserve, that they are happy to see destroyed or maybe replaced every 30 years?
Okay, so Dr. Miyagi or Professor Kawai, who will talk with you?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to discuss about, especially the meaning of the things. And probably my understanding is that if you use the different material from the original, probably it will lose the meaning, I would say. Because as I told you, as I said, when you use a specific materials, it relates to the something very wide background for the technology or production of the resource and those kind of things. So I think still I should probably new material or shouldn't be used to subsidize or to the substitution of the some kind of destroyed part of the structures and so on. And for the funding, we know the donation from the companies are tax deductible, but many companies in Japan, upon their compliances, they will not allow to make a donation for one specific religious body. Many of them. When we have every time we have a major restoration work, we have tried to raise the fund or raise the donation, but every time we have a very difficult time. And also the Ministry of Revenue of Japanese government, they have a very strict regulation for them to get some allowance or to give a permission to do it. And for example, in major shrine in Kyoto, like a Shimogama shrine, probably some people know that they are very, very much suffering from those kind of conditions, and they lease their land for the real estate developer to build the condominium. Probably many from Kyoto would know that, to get a fund to re-roof the entire shrines. That is happening actually right now in Japan, happening in Japan.
Thank you very much.
Well, the meaning of the preserve or conservation might be different from the different sectors. For the craftsman, for example, the meaning of the such as conservation is maybe to keep the morphology, figures itself. For the people in the religious sect, maybe tradition and spirits are more important. And for us, very, very interesting materials, therefore, the material itself is very, as a researcher. So that maybe we can say in different answers in such questions, but the continuity of the tradition in certain countries, that is the most important point. How we can continue, or how can I say, sustain in such a culture, spirits, materials, everything which is whole. We cannot divide into materials and spirits in such a case.
Thank you very much. I would like to request more questions, but the time is up, so we would like to close this session by pausing to distinguished speakers. Thank you very much.